Morning, everyone. Today's lesson is called Anglo Superiority, Christianity, and the Satanic Doctrine of Discovery. This will be part 4 in our series. Today, we're going to continue to talk about the creation of the Roman Emperor Constantine's creation. I call it a Frankenstein. Yeshua calls it Babylon the Great, mystery religion. He also calls it a harlot. He also calls it a prostitute. He also calls it the mother of all prostitutes and obscenities of the world. That's what he calls this organization that we call the church. They also created its leader, the one that everybody prays to. His name is Jesus. That is a fictitious name. That is a made-up individual. Just like Santa Claus, just like the Easter Bunny, all of those things, you can pray to those names, but they can't do anything for you because they're fictitious characters. You think Santa Claus can come down a little small chimney, a big fat white man in a red suit, and once he got down there, what color would that red suit be? In fact, you'd probably point a gun at him because he would look like a black man. His face would not be rosy red, it would be black. His lips would be red from coming down the chimney, rubbing against those red bricks. And he would be wearing black clothes because the soot would cover his white skin. It would also cover all of his clothes. And so you would think that is a black man robbing your house on Christmas Eve trying to steal your present. Santa Claus is a fictitious character, just like the fictitious character they made up that we pray to called Jesus. They're making a buffoon of God's people. We need to turn to the name that is above every name, and that is the name of Yeshua, because at the name of Yeshua, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that he is the Lord of lords and he is the King of kings. No one will come to the Father unless they come through not Jesus, but Yeshua. Satan is the one that has deceived the whole world. We're going to talk more about Constantine's creation and the doctrines that drove that creation. Let us open up in a prayer. Dear Yeshua, we come to you humbly. Open up our ears and open up our hearts and minds that we might understand that we have been bamboozled, that we might understand the truth that you want us to know, that we might turn to you and that we might call upon your name, that we might truly be saved. We pray that you would, Father, expose the wiles of the devil, that you would expose the schemes of the devil, and you would illuminate this counterfeit that Satan has deceived the entire world with. In Yeshua's holy name we ask this. Amen and amen. Let's jump in. God says that in the last days that mankind would be deceived. He says, take heed, lest you be not deceived. This deception would take hold of the entire planet. What is he talking about? What kind of deception could deceive all mankind, regardless of where you live, regardless of what your culture is, regardless of what skin color you have? What kind of deception could Satan come up with that could fool the world in this manner? We're going to talk about one of the ways. It is through religion. Religion is something that man makes up. He uses religion to manipulate mankind. Religion has nothing to do with the Creator God. It has nothing to do with our Savior, Yeshua, because He came to give us a path to everlasting life. He came to earth to do what we were not able to do for ourselves. He gave us a law that was impossible for us to keep. But we needed to see that even when we do our best, it falls short of the perfection that the law demands. So God wrapped himself in flesh. He called himself Yeshua. He walked the dusty roads of this earth. He was born without a sin nature. He was not connected through the seed of Adam because he was born of woman. Therefore, the seed, the poison seed of Adam, was not in him. He was the only human being other than Adam that did not have that seed. Therefore, if he could live perfectly to God's holy law, his blood could save all that call upon him and trust in what he have done. Not in what they have done. That's what religion does. No, what he have done. And so if we can put all of our faith in him, like we put our faith in an airline pilot who is driving the airplane, there is nothing you can do but sit in the seat and leave the driving to the pilot. We're to trust Yeshua and rest on not what we have done, but rest on what he have done. We call that the way. He says you must be born again. And he says, remember, you didn't choose me. I must choose you. The world was made for many, but the world to come was only made for a remnant of mankind. Only a remnant will listen. This is a very deceptive world. We're going to talk about one of those great deceptions that is deceiving the entire world to this very moment. In order to understand the origins of Christianity, let's go back to its beginning, to its creator, Emperor Constantine. We're going to talk a little bit about the origin of this anglicized marriage of paganism and tenets of the way. They called it Christianity. It still goes by that name to this present day. It has a very, very bloody history. It is mentioned in the Bible as Babylon the Great, mystery religion. Yeshua calls it a prostitute. He calls it an abomination. He also says that it is responsible for the blood of God's chosen people. So let me give you a rundown as to the origin and the creation of this monstrosity, as Yeshua calls it. Its birth was AD 325. Paganism in Christianity and ultimately in the Roman Catholic Church. It all started with the Roman Emperor Constantine's conversion to the way, in which he later changed the name to Christianity. This is the name he gave to his Frankenstein monstrosity that was a marrying of Roman, Greek, and ancient Babylonian and Egyptian paganism with tenets of the way. He called it Christianity. It has nothing to do with the way. If you were to ask Yeshua what was Christianity in his day, he would not know because it did not exist. Paul was not a Christian because Christianity wasn't born until 325 AD. Apostle Paul was long dead. Apostle Peter was long dead. In fact, all of the apostles were long dead, so they were never called Christian. The people of the way were never called Christian, not until Constantine created Christianity in 325 AD. It occurred after a battle, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in October AD 312. This was the key battle in the civil war fought for control of the empire between Constantine and Maxentius. Before the battle, Constantine supposedly had a vision of a flaming cross in the sky. It wasn't a so-called Christian symbol or a symbol of the way. Rather, it was a symbol of the sun god. It had the Greek inscription on it, says, "By this sign conquer." We are required to believe that Constantine was told by the Prince of Peace, Yeshua, which he later called Jesus, to use the sign of the cross. We know this was not Yeshua speaking, because he did not die on a cross. He died on a pole. Yet this vision that he saw, according to Constantine, was a cross, not a pole. This was the first problem with his vision. Actually, it was the second problem with his vision. The Prince of Peace, in his vision, told him to go out and slaughter his enemies. This was not Yeshua's way. This was the way of the Romans. They were a bloody people who lived by the sword. It is interesting to note that 2 years earlier, in AD 310, Constantine claimed he saw a vision of the sun god Apollo and publicly made vows to serve him. After his victory against Maxentius, Constantine went to Apollo's shrine to make sacrifices. His victory, however, did enable Constantine to come to power as Emperor of Rome. For 280 years, converts of the Way had been persecuted by the Romans. Then suddenly, in March AD 313, with the Edict of Milan, Constantine created a new Frankenstein religion he called Christianity. He made it the official religion of the Roman Empire, and the persecutions of the Way as a result ceased. Constantine was a realist. He understood that there needed to be a change made to restore unity in his empire. He saw that through this new religion, which used fragments of the Way, Roman, Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian paganism, Roman emperor worship, and Anglo-Saxon white supremacy, this new concoction of a religion enabled Constantine to politically unite the culturally and religiously diverse Anglo-Saxon populations of the Roman Empire. Through the Christian church, he could have a people group who were morally strong, hardworking, and would be loyal to him. By his issuing the Edict of Toleration for not only this new religion, but for all religions within the Roman Empire, including the pagan religions of Rome. He became not only the head of the church, the Christian church that he created, but also a leader to whom the previously persecuted converts of the Way were deeply indebted to. Constantine was very pragmatic. He realized that over the vast extent of the Roman Empire, he could not expect everyone to forsake their religious beliefs to embrace this new Frankenstein religion called Christianity. He therefore promoted the adoption of pagan beliefs by the Christian church. He allowed it. Not only did he allow it, he encouraged it. He encouraged it as a means of unifying the Roman population, the Roman Anglo-Saxon population. Although this brought an end to the persecution of the converts of the Way, which they now called Christians, the result was far worse than the persecution. The corruption of the Way. The Way was replaced by this new Frankenstein religion called Christianity. The history and the majesty of the Way was completely whitewashed and hidden. The Hebrew scriptures were collected and then translated into Anglo languages, perverting some of the text to further achieve his goals of white supremacy that would later dominate the globe. Evidence of where Constantine's loyalties lie can clearly be seen in the Arch of Constantine, which he had built next to the Colosseum after the Battle of the Milan Bridge. To celebrate his victory now, as I stated earlier, Constantine claimed that before the battle, Yeshua gave him a vision of a cross in the sky, saying to him, "In this sign conquer." Yet Constantine's arch was decorated with images of the goddess Victoria, and sacrifices were made to Apollo, Diana, and Hercules. Furthermore, on the east side of the arch, facing the rising sun, is a rendering of the sun god Apollo. Then on top of his arch, Constantine erected a bronze statue of himself in a chariot with 4 horses, in the same manner as Apollo is depicted when traveling the sky each day. Any evidence that Constantine was grateful to this person he called Jesus for his victory was absent from the arch that he had erected. Despite his legalizing of his new Frankenstein religion called Christianity in the empire and being head of the church, Constantine remained a pagan, worshiping pagan gods, sacrificing to the sun gods Mithra and Apollo. So he wasn't really a Christian, as the church today is saying that he was converted to Christianity, which is a false religion anyhow. It has nothing to do with the way. It has nothing to do with what Yeshua stood for and what he taught. It doesn't lead you to Yeshua. It leads you to a fictitious character created by Constantine called Jesus. Yeshua did not give him the vision that Christianity today is built upon. It is built upon a lie by a very shrewd politician who is very, very narcissistic. And he was a sadistic killer as well, and a white supremacist. His church and the foundation of his church is built on the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon people over all other people. This attitude is reflected in the doctrine of discovery, which I will discuss next. This doctrine of discovery is a major pillar of white supremacy within the Christian church, not only of the mother church, but also all of her children. As Yeshua said, she is a harlot herself, and she is the mother of harlots. Yeshua called her a obscenity and a prostitute, but this prostitute also had smaller obscenities, and they also turned out to prostitute themselves with the world, with the devil, and with the flesh. Constantine did not associate his vision with the God of the way. He saw it through his pagan eyes. He saw it as a pagan vision. Personally, I believe he did not have a vision at all, because he knew Yeshua was not crucified on a cross. Look at the picture on the screen. This was the manner of crucifixion that the Romans used. Constantine knew it. So why would he believe that a cross, which was an ancient symbol of the sun god Mithra, why would he believe that cross was associated with the children of the way and Yeshua, which the Romans crucified on a pole? That is a historical fact. So he set out for his own political purposes to build a Frankenstein religion that would incorporate all the religions of Rome, unifying his fractured collection of different warring ethnicities within his fractured empire. His goal was to come up with a means, a political means that would marry the political landscape with a religion, incorporate tenets of each one of the religions. He needed to create something pliable enough to do that. It worked beautifully. It pulled all of these individuals within his empire together, giving him full control over the entire empire. All he had to do is take over the headship of this new religion he called Christianity. Let's talk about that creation. Here is a picture of it, starting with the mother of all harlot. And then you see all the little baby harlot that was hatched from the mother harlot. Yeshua calls it Babylon the Great. Why does he call it Babylon the Great? Because they used a lot of the Babylonian paganism, mixed it in with paganisms of Rome and Greece and anything else that was needed for Constantine to take over an empire. Yeshua calls it the mother of all prostitutes and obscenities in the world. We've got people singing praises to it. We've got people dying for it. We've got people thinking that it is this virtuous model of love and compassion. I beg to differ with you. Its history is completely different. I'm going to give you a little bit of that history so that you know that we're not just blowing smoke. We're not just talking against the church. We're talking against a global deception is what we're talking against. God says resist the devil, expose his work, resist the schemes. Watch out for the schemes of the devil. Well, this is one of his schemes. In fact, it is the best scheme that he's ever come up with. Yeshua talks about this obscenity in Revelation chapter 17 and Revelation chapter 18. Here are some of her attributes, some of her history, some of her sins, if you will. Colonialism. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Genocide, slavery of God's chosen people, dehumanization of not only God's chosen people, but other non-Anglo-Saxon peoples around the world. They were literally dehumanized by this organism. The Inquisitions, where people were tortured until they would confess their sins in an attempt to force them to comply and convert to this Frankenstein of Constantine. Much blood was shed in America by God's chosen people because of the black codes. All of this came about because of this monstrosity. Mass murder of God's chosen people, lynching them from trees. Where do you think they got that from? Yeshua was tortured and crucified on a pole, on a tree, if you will. Mass dehumanization of God's chosen people and other indigenous peoples by this monstrosity, this Babylon the Great, this mother of all harlots and obscenities of planet Earth. Oppression of God's chosen people because they were not Anglo-Saxons and because they know their true identity, that they are the chosen people of God. This is why they are hated by all nations, because Yeshua said they would be hated by all nations. Do you know that we're the only people group on earth that is hated by all nations for no reason? We've never started a world war. We've never dropped a nuclear weapon on anybody. We've never committed genocide against anyone. Yet we are most hated of all peoples on earth. Why is that? It is because we disobeyed our God and our Savior, the one who picked us out of all the nations to be a special peoples to himself, that we might be a shining peoples on a hill for all to see, because God picked us to have a special relationship with him. This is why the Anglo world hates us. This is why they have transported that hatred to every other ethnicity against God's chosen people. They terrorize God's chosen people generation after generation for 400 years. They whitewashed our history and hid our identity from us, taking our identity, giving it to Anglo-Saxons who call themselves Jewish. And if you say anything about them, they say you're being anti-Semitic. No, when you harm one of God's chosen people who happen to be black, that is anti-Semitism. They hid our history. They distorted our history. They said we come from nothing. Now they have many of us acting like nothing. God says of this monstrosity in Revelation chapter 17 verse 6, I could see that she she was drunk. Who is she? She is this monstrosity created by Constantine. I could see that she was drunk, not just tasting of the blood of God's people. She was drunk with the blood of God's holy people who were witnesses for Yeshua. The Apostle John says, I stared at her in complete amazement of how such a monstrosity could exist and could incarcerate and slaughter God's people like they have. An organization that has no fear of God at all. If they did, they would have never put their hands on God's chosen people, the apple of his eye. But their punishment will come. It will come. We'll talk about that after we finish talking about church. What that punishment will be. It will be worldwide because her sins has been worldwide. It will cause an end to the world as we know. Listen at this next video. They have a doctrine of discovery. It is based in white supremacy and white superiority over all other ethnicities of the world, and it is embedded in Christianity. In fact, it is one of the foundational bedrock of the church. So let's take a look.
Let's go into the 15th century now. So the 1400s, right? You got the Portuguese trading with Africa, okay? And sometimes they're taking Africans by force. And then in 1455, you get the Pope Nicholas V. He issues a papal bull and he says this. Now, bear in mind, back then, this is the biggest Christian leader in the Western world, okay? And this is what he said. He said, we granted, among other things, free and ample faculty to the aforesaid King Alfonso. So he's saying what permission he's given King Alfonso to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wherever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods, whatsoever held and possessed by them, and, check it out, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Okay? A bit later he says, thence also many Guineamen and other Negroes taken by, and by the way, I just want to be clear, throughout this session, when you hear me use the word Negro, if I use it, I'm using it as the reported speech of what other people have said or thought. Okay, I just want to be very clear. If you doze off at any point and come back and hear me use that word, understand I'm saying this is what the person I'm talking about was saying or arguing. So he says, Guineamen and other Negroes taken by force and some by barter of unprohibited articles or by other lawful contract of purchase have been sent to the said kingdoms. A large number of these have been converted to the Catholic faith, and it is hoped by the help of divine mercy that if such progress be continued with them, either those peoples will be converted to the faith, or at least the souls of many of them will be gained for Christ. So right here, notice, first off, the concept of seeking out slaves. The religious leader of the day is telling people they can seek out slaves. It's very different to the Old Testament law when it's dealing with slavery. It's dealing with the reality that sometimes in war, you end up with slaves. You're either going to kill the people on the other side, or you're going to make them your slaves. It's very different with the Old Testament law dealing with the concept of, if you're really poor, you could go to someone and say, look, I'll work for you as a slave for 7 years and then release me. Very different concept. This is actually seeking out slaves, and it's coming from the church, the concept. I'm not saying they're the first people. There were always kidnappers for a long time, man stealers. But the leader of the church is sanctioning it from the church. Bear in mind, he's saying this even though 1 Timothy 1:10 gives a condemnation to slave traders in the New Testament. But notice as well the concept of perpetual slavery, the idea here that you can actually reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, to a slavery that goes on and on and on without an end. Notice also that the Pope talks about the benefits of conversion as if slavery is a good thing. Like, you can go stealing people, and you know what? We've already seen some people have become Christians from it. So this is a good thing. This is a pretty terrible justification of slavery. So you've got an image bearer here who is not using their power to serve and protect, but they're using their power and they're using their voice to actually hurt image bearers. So it's dehumanizing other image bearers. But the Pope is himself dehumanizing himself in the process by not acting as an image bearer should. Now, a bit later than this, in 1492, you got Columbus. He goes to the Caribbean. Columbus is an Italian explorer. In his log entry about the Caribbean inhabitants, he says, they were well built with good bodies. Now, if you remember what we've seen from people like Thomas Aquinas and others, if you hear someone talk about someone being well built with good bodies, you're going to be a bit like, uh-oh, because in some people's minds, that means maybe you were made to be a slave. You know, by the way, I'm not saying Thomas Aquinas would totally say that if he was here, you know, but he did say there are some people with a strong body seem to be naturally fitted for service. And Columbus says they're well built with good bodies and handsome features. He says they do not bear arms. Okay, and that's key, because this is how so much colonization and enslavement happened. It happened from European powers having weaponry that was sophisticated. But what's interesting is you hear people keep referring to their intelligence. It's their intelligence that shows why they should make slaves, because they are superior, not bringing up the fact that actually it was their weaponry. Now, some people might say, yes, but their weaponry, is that just from their intelligence? We've got to bear in mind, not all the European intelligence comes from Europe, right? So the idea of these big boats, you know, that were used to travel down to Africa and used to transport slaves, those ships, that concept of big ships, the design of them, the technology came from the Muslim world. It didn't come from the European world. Anyway, he then says they would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. So notice the concept in Columbus's mind that these people's physique makes them suited for slavery. I think that's what he's getting at. He certainly thinks they're suited for slavery. And notice that he thinks they can just go and subjugate them. It's just a matter of whether they can or not, which he's saying they can if they got enough men. And so it's not recognizing, as image bearers, we've been authorized to use our power to serve and protect and to rule with other humans over the animals, but we haven't been authorized to rule over other humans as a slave-master relationship. So it really messed up image of God thinking.
Look at the picture on the screen. This is the reason why Yeshua called this a monstrosity. He called it the mother of all harlots. He called it a worldwide obscenity. Why would he say such a thing? He looked down through history and he saw what Satan's masterpiece would do. He gave it apt descriptions. I am really glad when I know their history that the name was not given the Church of Yeshua, that it's a fictitious name, a name like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. It is a made-up name. But behind that name are worldwide atrocity and abomination. This, what you see on the screen, is an abomination to Yeshua. Look at what it says. Jesus saves. Jesus saves whom? First of all, who is Jesus? He is not Yeshua. Yeshua says to hallow my name. Yeshua says there's no other name given among mankind by which we might be saved, that man might call upon, but the name of Yeshua, not the name of Jesus. The name Jesus could not have existed during that time. Jesus also was fictitious. Yeshua could not have been a Christian. Why? Because Christianity wasn't going to be invented until 325 years after his death. So none of the people that is mentioned in the Bible were Christians. This picture shows what these people really are. They are children of Satan, and they're doing the things that their father does. They hate the same people their father hates. Just like Yeshua says, no, you are of your father the devil, and you want to do the same things that the devil does. He wants to destroy the people of God. Satan makes his people puffed up with pride, thinking that the color of their skin makes them more superior to everyone else. The emperor worship, the worship of human beings, has been a staple of the Anglo experience. The more people that this hideous organization brings to itself, the more control they have over the minds of God's holy people. The more control they have over the things of this world. That is their God. The things of this world. They lust for power. They lust for domination. And that is what the church is. If you don't agree with me, do your homework, study your history, and I think your mind will change very, very quickly, because the history is there for all to see. In the past, they were able to hide these things, but not now, not with the internet, not with TikTok, not with all of these things. Remember what Yeshua said in the Old Testament. He says that knowledge in the last days would be increased. Travel and education would be increased. Now we can know the truth, and the truth is the only thing that's going to set us free. Don't get me wrong. Don't try to put me in the bucket of saying I am not a born-again individual, because I am. I know the real God, and his name is not Jesus. His name is Yeshua. He is the one that died on a pole for me. He is the one that sent his Holy Spirit to seek me out, and not just me, but many, many others, black, white, of all different ethnicities. But you know what? Pride comes before a fall. It is preceded by a haughty spirit, and that's what this false Frankenstein church, this religion called Christianity, have brought to this world. Death and carnage. It has divided the world up into little pieces. Let me help to educate you, because I know a lot of people won't do their research. So let me help to educate you on what the doctrine, the church's doctrine of discovery is. Let me explain how it is responsible for colonizing the world and chopping up the world for the Anglo-Saxon race. Listen at this next video and pay close attention.
In 1492, Columbus landed in the Americas, and to this day he is seen as the man who discovered that land. But how can that be possible if there were millions of people already living here? Let's delve into this idea. Well, his discovery was ingrained in law in something called the doctrine of discovery, something that remains the basis for Canadian law and still impacts Indigenous peoples today. So what is the doctrine of discovery? The doctrine of discovery is a series of papal bulls. Papal bulls are a type of public decree issued by the Pope of the Catholic Church. These papal bulls were written between 1452 and 1493. The doctrine of discovery said that when European nations discovered non-European lands that were not ruled by Christians, those European nations had special rights over the land, regardless of those who were already living on the land. From this time on, indigenous nations and people lost full property rights and ownership of their land. Indigenous people were only allowed to occupy and use their land. But then the question is this: how does this still impact indigenous people today? First, the doctrine of discovery was a way to legitimize the colonization of lands outside of Europe. Second, the concept of discovery assumed that people already living in these lands were less than human. Discovery requires dehumanization, otherwise you could not simply take land because it would be considered stealing. This was seen in the term terra nullius within the doctrine, which means nobody's land. But clearly it was somebody's land. Indigenous people lived there. However, under this doctrine, the land could not be legally owned unless it was settled by Europeans. Sylvia McAdam says, "The very idea that one group of people could assert dominance over another through slavery, death, and servitude by virtue of being religiously superior is absurd." The United Nations has denounced the doctrine of discovery, but the policies and laws that grew out of the doctrine of discovery have come to shape Canada's societies, ideas, and attitudes about Indigenous peoples and their rights. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states that this doctrine is the shameful root of all discrimination and marginalization Indigenous people face today. Moreover, the doctrine of discovery creates a problem with Canadian law. Whenever land claims occur, Crown or Canadian sovereignty is always presumed to exist, but the Indigenous people must prove their presence. This sounds backwards, doesn't it? Indigenous people in Canada are always told that the underlying title of the Crown is the basis of their ownership to all lands and resources. It is this underlying title that many call the application of the doctrine of discovery in today's society. Just to illustrate that the doctrine of discovery is still very much alive and well today, we just have to look at a few legal precedents. In 1823, an American Supreme Court decision, Johnson v. McIntosh, affirmed the doctrine of discovery in American common law. This case has been cited at least 44 times in Canadian courts.
Despite Indigenous peoples being the obvious occupants of the lands in North America at the time of initial European exploration, Canadian law is able to dismiss this fact because of the doctrine of discovery.
This country has been built upon this universally recognized idea that monarchs had title to Indigenous lands because of discovery. The Assembly of First Nations calls this a breach of natural justice. While it does not change past injustices, the federal government should formally renounce discovery. This would acknowledge responsibility and recognize the obligations Canada has in the present to First Nations. It would be more than a merely symbolic gesture, as it would lay to rest an offensive legal justification based on racial superiority for the subjugation of First Nations and other Indigenous peoples. AFN, Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery.
Here is yet another video that describes how the church have come to its lofty position, owning the wealth of the land, owning the wealth of this country and many other countries, colonizing the world, carving it up for the Anglo-Saxon power. This is an evil doctrine. It was evil from its inception, and it's still in effect today, and it's still just as evil as it has been in the past. This video speaks to the origin of this white supremacist idea of land acquisition and colonization of planet Earth. The legal justification for this practice and the creation of this practice came through Christianity and its leadership. Listen at this next video. It will help you to understand the historical roots and the birth of the doctrine of discovery. You will also learn what a papal edict is. It is called a papal bull. It is a legal document given the colonial powers and the Anglo race power to enslave, vanquish, rape, and kill and subjugate anyone that is not white. This is how the world came to be the way it is today through this hideous, evil, satanic doctrine. Its root is rooted in white superiority and white supremacy and white rule over everyone and everything. It gives them the right to create God in whatever image they want him to be in, with whatever name they want to give it, and then to force the rest of the world to bow down to it. Listen at this next video.
It's one of the biggest frauds that ever was perpetrated on people, and it's not just in Canada or the United States, it's all over the world. The doctrine of discovery was evil from the beginning, and it's still evil today. That's taken the soul out of Indigenous people when you take their land.
The doctrine of discovery is this fundamental lie that non-Indigenous people can show up, plant a flag, and claim a right to own the land and displace Indigenous laws over the land.
It's a legal fiction. It's not law. It's akin to a country going in and sprinkling magic dust over something, and that gives them ownership to it.
The doctrine of discovery has created the foundation for legal developments where the United States and Canada get to claim lands that were Indigenous lands.
The origin of the doctrine of discovery begins with the papal bulls and the dividing up of the world by the Catholic Church.
A papal bull is a written decree issued by the Pope. Back in the 1400s, there was a series of papal bulls that basically gave Christian nations the religious authority to seize lands and resources of non-Christians and to enslave them. If you've ever watched Disney's Pocahontas, you've seen this enacted.
I hereby claim this land and all its riches.
The doctrine of discovery relates to a legal principle known as terra nullius, which is Latin for nobody's land. The papal bulls inspired the idea that anyone who wasn't Christian was inferior, and therefore unworthy of land ownership. So by this logic, the Americas were terra nullius and free to claim.
We were heathens, we were savages, and that attitude continued. It's why we have all of these laws, policies, and regulations and practices that subdue, oppress, surveil, and control Indigenous peoples.
It's this racist principle that comes from the Catholic Church that was formulated in the US Supreme Court, and then it was adopted by Canadian courts.
So while the papal bulls didn't directly create a legal doctrine, it became a legal doctrine through various court cases in the United States.
In 1823, the case of Johnson versus McIntosh was considered before the United States Supreme Court. The case involved a piece of land that was allegedly sold to Thomas Johnson by a Native American tribe. The US later sold that same piece of land to William McIntosh. Chief Justice Marshall ruled in favor of McIntosh on the grounds that the US owned the land. And this decision was based on what's become known as the doctrine of discovery.
Chief Justice Marshall, prancing around his home, how am I going to resolve this? And he stumbles on this doctrine of discovery. And he uses that as a legal principle and says the Indians never had anything to sell in the first place.
This was a legal principle between European nations, that whichever discovered a territory first had the sole right of title to the lands. While the court acknowledged indigenous peoples could use the lands, the exclusive title went to the crown.
So you can imagine over several hundred years that gets well ingrained into American law, and then it gets incorporated into Canadian law.
There's 3 constitutional cases that you need to know about. They shaped Canada using the logic of the doctrine of discovery. The first case is St. Catharines Milling. Back in 1888, there was a dispute over logging rights in northwestern Ontario. Basically, who owned the land. The highest court of appeal at that time ruled that Indigenous interest in the land only existed by the grace or goodwill of the Crown.
So that was bad, but it got overturned effectively in Calder.
The Calder case was in 1967. Frank Calder and other Nisga'a elders sued the BC government saying that the Nisga'a never extinguished their land rights. They appealed all the way to the Supreme Court.
Listen at this next video. It will give you additional information as to the white supremacist view of the world as it issues its papal bulls giving Anglo missionaries the right to enslave, rape, pillage, and kill anyone that was non-white and anyone that was not a Christian. By the way, it didn't make any difference if they were black or brown or any other ethnicity. If they were not white, they were subject to enslavement and inhuman treatment. They were thought to be less than humans. They were branded. They were slaughtered without mercy, many of them thrown overboard. You might look at the Anglo nations and say, well, they made a pretty good omelet. And, to make that omelet, we had to break a few eggs. Yes, but that's not really what happened. What happened is that they went into countries that were more developed than they were, yet they were vulnerable because they were less militaristic. They did not live by the sword and by conquering other nations as the Anglo nations were. That left them open to slavery and colonization. However, their academics was usurped by the European powers, absorbed and taken into their countries as if the Anglo nations came up with these disciplines of higher education and knowledge of many, many things. They were stolen along with everything else and absorbed into Anglo universities and Anglo cultures. Listen at this next video.
Discovery is when you go to a culture that's not Christian and you do the things that the papal bulls asked you to do. Discovery is when you go to a culture that's not Christian and you do the things that the papal bulls asked you to do. Take it over completely, own it, enslave, make everyone Christian eventually. All of that was called discovery. But it really is time that we get history straight and come to understand who the real destructive players in the world have been for the last 400 years. And they have to be held historically accountable. Namaste, and welcome to Vedic Vidya. My name is Jeffrey Armstrong, Kavindra Rishi. Vedic Vidya is available exclusively on Chitty Media, English channel, Sunday nights at 7 p.m. IST. Our topic tonight is how the Catholic Church and the papal bulls it issued instigated colonization of the world, or why the Pope declared war on the entire world in the name of Jesus Christ. I'm pretty certain that, like me, you did not hear about this in your high school or college history classes. I have many degrees from university, too many to mention, and no one told me about this point in history. And I do have to say to you that when I found out that the colonizing of the world was instigated, purposely put in motion, and planned to the nth detail by the then head of the Catholic Church, there are several different messages or edicts that were signed at that time and circulated amongst the European powers. The year of this one is January 8th, 1455. So what has this got to do with the Vedic culture, you're thinking? Well, this is the historical moment in which European countries were sent out into the world by ship with a mandate from the Pope in the Vatican through his papal bulls, giving them permission to colonize, pillage, occupy, enslave, and in every way dominate, finally convert to Catholicism the residents of any culture that was not Christian. That's the gist of it. And these edicts that were given out by the pontiff were called papal bulls. Just a footnote, but it is a little humorous, don't you think? The irony of the situation, that colloquially that word has a different meaning now. Who knew? So here's what happened. At that time, and there's an interesting history coinciding with this, because in 1520, not too many years later, Henry VIII of England would try to divorce his then queen to marry Anne Boleyn, be unable to do so because the Pope would not give him permission. And meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation was going on in Germany with Luther. And England switched horses, and the king turned away from the Pope. And this was in the heart of the colonialism that was instigated 70 years earlier by the Pope. So the English became pirates, but the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, all had complete permission. In fact, in these papal bulls, the world is divided into two parts along latitude and longitude lines, and they're given to these countries, and they're told to go there, take everything, enslave the people. You might have heard of residential schools. Residential schools were established on the basis of these papal bulls, because the last thing you were supposed to do after you steal everything and enslave everyone is make them a Christian, separate them from their parents, and force them to become Christian. It doesn't give me great pleasure to be the one delivering this to you, because I've always been an idealist, and this is so far from ideal. But it really is time that we get history straight and come to understand who the real destructive players in the world have been for the last 400 years. And they have to be held historically accountable. Now, this should not lead to more violence. That would be a terrible irony. So don't get angry and go take it out on someone. Get wise to the forces that have been making our world into what it is, so that together we can change it. And this is a story I'm bringing to you from the Vedic Vidya perspective, because India was one of the countries that was colonized under these papal bulls. So everything that took place afterwards was a playbook that was initiated from the Vatican in Rome. And it's very important that you know this, and you can find it online. Just go to Google and look up papal bulls for colonization. You'll find them and print them out. They're 12-page documents, all written in English translated out of the Latin, but Latin legalese if you read Latin and want to read them in the original. But these documents simply created a period in history. Now, it's very important to understand, during that period in history, there were apologists for this perspective, none of whom said what was really going on, all of whom were justifying why they were doing it. That justification and those excuses as to why it was all right to do this in the name of religion or in the name of anything are a mystery for you to ponder and for me to ponder. And when you're initially over the shock of understanding that it was religions who sent armed individuals from cultures throughout Europe, anyone who wanted to, who was Christian, could attach themselves to these bulls or to this bull. There, someone had to say it. Universities had endowments of chairs that participated in and helped for another kind of, now I need to give you the name, this is called discovery. There's a technical term, legal term. Discovery is when you go to a culture that's not Christian and you do the things that the papal bulls asked you to do. Take it over completely, own it, enslave, make everyone Christian eventually. All of that was called discovery. Now, is that the word you used in high school when they said the period in history called the time of discovery? Did someone PS and say, by the way, it was a papal bull and they were permission to steal, rob, rape, pillage, and convert? No, me either. So it turns out that Catholics instigated, but the Protestants said, why not? But at first, England, who was exempt because they didn't like the Pope anymore, they became pirates. And many of the first political leaders in the so-called New World, or destroyed Old World of indigenous cultures, were pirates from England. But together, all of these powers eventually decided that this was all a worthy venture, discovering the next version of it was if a culture had knowledge, you could take that knowledge, call it your own, reframe it in your language, not say where you got it, and that was called intellectual discovery. Didn't you think that intellectual discovery meant people who were smart thought things up? That's not true. Intellectual discovery meant very clever academics usually went to a culture, learned knowledge from that culture, stole it, wrote it in a thesis, called it their own, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is where what we call modern psychology came from, and much of modern philosophy or European philosophy. At each stage of colonization, intellectuals would steal ideas from ancient cultures like India. They would not give them credit. They would simply take the ideas, make them into something they could become famous for, call themselves a philosopher, a psychologist, all of those kinds of titles. And so academia was deeply, deeply embroiled in this and was owned by the colonizing corporations in the same way now that money talks, nobody walks, you've got the dough, we'll put on a show. That's the saying in Coney Island, but kind of the rule everywhere now, because this is the world that is the result of colonization. Now, I'm not telling you this just to make you upset or to get you angry. In fact, like I said, don't get angry. Don't get even. Get wise. Wise up. And first of all, look at the account of the cultures that were colonized, created by those who colonized them, and say that's probably not true.
This next video gives you some recent information concerning the Catholic Church's doctrine of discovery. The Pope has denounced the practice, but did not discontinue the practice. He apologized to some of the Native Americans and Native Canadians, but the doctrine was not rescinded. Because if the Pope, who sees himself as infallible, of course the Church have declared the office of the Pope and the one that sits in that office as being infallible, how can an infallible person not agree with the doctrine that they legalized and gave permission to Anglo colonial powers to enslave, vanquish, and steal other people's land? If he were to do that, he would have to admit that he wasn't infallible. So they kind of went part ways, but not all of the way. Listen at this next video.
Well, earlier this month, the Vatican formally rejected its doctrine of discovery. The papal decree, or bull, was declared centuries ago and was used to legitimize the seizure of indigenous lands, mostly in Africa and the Americas. Now, riddled with racial and religious superiority, it eventually insinuated its way into the more modern laws of the United States, Canada, and Latin America. It justified what today would commonly be judged as illegal land seizures and human rights abuses. And though it's taken centuries to repudiate, the Vatican statement says the decree has never been considered expressions of the Catholic faith. Last year, during a visit to the Canadian Arctic, Pope Francis apologized to First Nations people for the evil of the country's Catholic residential schools. Now, those schools became notorious for abuse and even murder of Canadian Indigenous children as they were forced to assimilate to white Catholic culture. Church doctrine also allowed Portugal and Spain to take territories in Africa and the rest of the Americas, and many argued it still informs government policy and laws in the United States. Here's a closer look.
The doctrine of discovery states that an explorer from a European Christian country can take ownership of any land they discover, regardless of any non-Christian inhabitants, and concede it to their home country. The papal bulls divided the world between Portugal and Spain, giving them free power, authority, and jurisdiction of every kind over all non-Christian lands. Most importantly, it gave them permission to enslave millions of people. The doctrine of discovery became a legal principle through a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1823. Two men bought same land, one purchased it from a Native American and the other from a federal government. The judge decided it did not belong to the Native American because it was never his to begin with. 65 years later, that decision was reflected in Canadian courts. The Supreme Court decided that land did not belong to Indigenous people because it became federal property when Europeans discovered it. Over hundreds of years, backed by the doctrine, precedents were set that led to the seizures of Indigenous lands and the displacement of Indigenous peoples.
I am touched by the way in which the document doesn't close the book. It doesn't attempt to say, and that's that, and we'll have no more of that, thank you.
Well, some Indigenous leaders have welcomed the statement as a good first step, but others have criticized the Vatican for not actually rescinding the doctrine in its entirety.
Doctrine of discovery itself has been used as a tool to dispossess Indigenous peoples of our inherent right to the lands upon which we live. But as you look throughout time, it's led to very racist, genocidal policies and practices by colonizing governments.
This false religion called Christianity has made a fool out of God's people. We are acting like buffoons. There are so many ministers who are simply preying on the people that claiming to be Christians instead of praying for the people. Look at the buffoonery of this next video, and then I will close with this. Until next week, shalom.
You
Bye.